Hey everyone, what's up? Jubitaz back with a special video for y'all where today we're going to be doing a hypothetical analysis. You see, I dropped a video recently about the Leaf Village propaganda, which I highly recommend for those that haven't seen it yet. But anyways, in that video I criticized every Hokage for their contribution to the darkness of the Will of Fire. However, I didn't criticize the Fourth Hokage, and the reason for that should be obvious. Minato Namikaze was like the Hokage that never got to be, or more like the Hokage that didn't get the chance to leave a lasting impact, considering how short his reign was. We don't know exactly how long his tenure as the Hokage lasted, since the timeline of the anime has always been hazy, though it's believed to have been 9 to 10 months at the bare minimum, for at least the duration of Kushina's pregnancy, and maybe up to a year-ish, year and a half at the most. And because of how short it was, we didn't get to see the Fourth Hokage's diplomatic or political skills at play. One event in particular that would have been interesting to see was how Minato would have handled the Uchiha coup d'etat, which brings us to today's topic. How would the Fourth Hokage have dealt with the Uchiha? Would the Uchiha even think of revolting if Minato was around? Would the clan even be pushed to the extent of planning the coup had Minato survived the Nine Tails incident? Well, those are the types of questions that we'll be tackling today. Now, if this was your first rodeo with us, then be sure to hit that subscribe button, and other than that, let's get straight to business. So in order to tackle this hypothetical, we have to first look at one key event that acted as the catalyst of the entire story and sealed the fate of the Uchiha clan, that being the Nine Tails attack on the Leaf. Because while the Uchiha did face some discrimination prior, all the surveillance and the scrutiny were massively exacerbated after this incident, which was almost fully blamed on the Uchiha clan by the village elders. And considering that the Fourth Hokage died alongside his wife sealing the tailed beast, he didn't get to tell anyone about the masked man until he meets his son as an astral projection more than 16 years later. So if Minato was alive afterwards, he'd likely absolve the Uchiha clan of having any involvement in the Nine Tails incident. It was clear that this masked man was an outsider to the village. Now, whether he would assume that Tobi was Madara or if he could figure out his true identity is a different story. If we fast forward to the war arc, when Minato found out that the masked man that attacked the village long ago was Obito, he got mentally nerfed and was left in a daze. Minato truly blamed himself for not recognizing that it was his student behind that attack, and believed that he could have averted all of the misfortune that occurred in the original timeline had he recognized him. And he even believed that he could have saved Kushina. Now, Minato's being pretty optimistic here, but the implication was that he could have talked Obito out of it and then safely sealed the Nine Tails back into Kushina, I guess. This is another point of debate, whether Minato could have talked no jutsu to Obito during the Nine Tails attack, or if he would have just had to find a way to kill him. When Obito attacked the village, he was still pretty upset that the sensei he used to look up to, the Yellow Flash, the fastest ninja on earth that was always late when it mattered most, and he took his anger out by unleashing the Nine Tails onto the village, which is something he didn't have to do and was counterintuitive to his plans if he wanted the bijou for the infinite Tsukuyomi. It was almost like he was subconsciously screaming to be saved, hiding his rage behind the masked Madara facade. So had Minato recognized who he was, it is possible that he could have saved him from the darkness. Now, I'm not saying that it was gonna be easy or that Obito would have just submitted like that, but it would have been easier to snap him out of his despair that early on. Remember that Obito's like the Naruto that lost hope, and unlike how Naruto always had someone in his corner to pull him out of despair in his lowest moments, Obito didn't have that luxury, and by the war arc, he'd invested too much time and energy into the Eye of the Moon plan, so it was a lot harder to get him to drop it so many years down the line. And if he was still subconsciously thinking about the righteous path after he'd spent 16 years working from the shadows and was minutes away from fulfilling the infinite Tsukuyomi, then I have no doubts that Minato would have had an easier time convincing a 15-year-old Obito that this world wasn't worth discarding, apologizing for not having been able to save him or to save Rin. And even if he'd struggle at first, he could potentially get to Obito. Of course, he won't just be able to overlook the attack he launched, and even if Hitaka no Jutsu'd him, Obito would still be treated as an enemy and have to pay for his sins. I could see him restraining Obito, putting him in a cell, and sealing his eyes like what they did with Sasuke after the Fourth War. Minato would probably have him sent to Ibiki for interrogation, and if that goes well, they could extract information he has about Madara, the Ghetto Statue, the Infinite Tsukuyomi, and maybe even Zetsu. Though his information about Zetsu will be limited, and maybe after a couple of years, Obito could be pardoned and tasked with protecting the village from the shadows, just like Sasuke was pardoned by Kakashi in the original timeline. The other possibility is that Obito doesn't get swayed and retreats like he originally did, but even then, if Minato figures out his real identity, then it's gonna be problematic for Toby, considering he has him tagged. And you could also try to get Kakashi to train his Mangekyo in order to be able to counter Obito's Kamui. But anyways, this video isn't about Obito, so let's continue with the hypothetical of Minato surviving the attack. Let's say that he successfully seals the Nine Tails back into Kushina and saves her, and then he goes to examine the damage caused by the Nine Tails in the village. Minato remaining alive would work strongly in the Uchiha clan's favor because he knew that they weren't involved with the attack, and he could clear their name to the elders and state that the perpetrator was either in custody and is being taken care of, or has been tagged and he's gonna deal with him later. Now the thing is, while the Kyuubi attack may have sealed the fate of the Uchiha clan, there was a preconceived bias against them from before, and I believe that Danzo would have looked for whatever reason to get rid of the clan, who he'd always believed were a threat to the village. That's why in the anime, he didn't allow the Uchiha police force to join the battle against the Fox because he distrusted them from the beginning. Danzo also believed that it was the second Hokage's belief that the Uchiha were dangerous and not to be trusted. The thing is that with Minato as the Hokage and not Hiruzen, Danzo won't have nearly as much influence or political power. Like, sure, he'd still have the foundation, but at least he'll have to remain in the shadows. And the two elders Koharu and Hamura won't be consulted as much as they were with Hiruzen, only in grave matters that concern the whole village, or when dealing with the Land of Fire's ruling class. And Hiruzen will likely serve as the intermediary between the two parties, assuming that he survives the Nine-Tail attack, of course. Going back to the Uchiha clan. Now, while the anime did give us a scene that implied that the Uchiha didn't hold the greatest opinion of Minato, and a lot of the Uchiha were salty that Fugaku was overlooked for the position of Fourth Hokage, which they attributed to the village's bias against the Uchiha clan, Fugaku was also considered a hero in the Third War, with the moniker of Wicked-Eyed Fugaku that sent shinobi from the other villages packing, though it's hard to say with certainty that it was as effective as the Yellow Flash. And despite this resentful sentiment held by the clan, it's believed that Fugaku and Minato themselves had a much more cordial or respectful relationship, considering that their wives seemed to be good friends. Mikoto and Kushina were close enough to joke around with one another, and Mikoto went to mourn Kushina's death in the anime, so I believe that Fugaku would have had a much easier time negotiating with the Fourth Hokage than he did with the Third. If we look at the Itachi novel, we get a more detailed list of the demands that the Uchiha had for the village elders, and frankly, most of their demands were reasonable. They wanted to move back closer to the center of the village, since the Uchiha felt slighted with how, despite how they were meant to be the main law enforcement of Konoha, many of their responsibilities were handed to the Anbu, so they felt like they were being undermined. They also didn't want to remain under the constant surveillance of the Anbu, and changed the police force so that it did not solely consist of Uchiha. That way the Uchiha wouldn't remain segregated to one faction within the Leaf. And now, while they did have another demand of Fugaku becoming the Hokage, apparently that was just a negotiation tactic that they were willing to concede to make it seem like they were giving ground. And this demand only came to be once they were pushed to the outskirts of the village and were getting pretty desperate. Fugaku himself didn't seem to be overtly interested in becoming the Hokage, and considering that in this timeline they'll be dealing with a more understanding state actor in Minato, I'm sure that they could come to some sort of deal or understanding. Minato would likely consider it better to compromise with the Uchiha clan to prevent civil unrest, and the Uchiha clan is less likely to want to stage an uprising with the Fourth as the acting Hokage. Their demands weren't so unreasonable that they couldn't be negotiated with. They just wanted to be located in the center so they could perform their duties better as the police, and for the police force to not be limited to Uchiha members. I'm sure that the elders won't be too happy with that. I mean, I don't see Hiruzen minding it too much. The two elders, Koharu and Hamura, won't complain about the Uchiha as much if they didn't suspect them in the Nine Tails incident, and if they weren't causing any troubles, and even if Danzo remains suspicious or disapproves of Minato's actions, it's not like he'll be able to twist his arm like he did with Hiruzen. Maybe he'll get his own Ambo root force to spy on the clan, but at least that won't be the official state doing it, which could in turn ease the tension in the relationship between the village and the clan quite a bit. Now Danzo might still try to pull some shit, since he didn't respect any Hokage's authority and was always involved in some sketchy schemes, and he also had a particular hate boner for the Uchiha clan, but it's unlikely that Minato would let him get away with as much as Hiruzen, and he especially won't tolerate any unwarranted actions against the Uchiha clan if they don't plot against the village, which I predicted they won't in this timeline. Now I'm not saying that Minato and Fugaku alone will be able to resolve the years of tension between the Leaf's establishment and the Uchiha clan, but they can for sure come to an understanding, especially considering that their wives had a decent relationship. At the worst case, Fugaku would have had to sanction or execute the hardcore rebel factions within the Uchiha clan, like Yashiro, Tekka, and Inabi Uchiha, and Minato would have had to deal with the anti-Uchiha factors within Konoha. I can see him trying to exile Danzo if he catches on to all of his schemes that would undermine Minato's authority as the Hokage and were in general against the Leaf's best interest. Now whether Hiruzen and the elders will step in to stop, that is a different story. All I know is that Minato won't be buying this "I'm doing everything to protect the Leaf" crap, and if Danzo tries to exacerbate the Uchiha incident, which was already a very tense situation, Minato would at the bare minimum apprehend Danzo and execute him if he has to. So with Minato and Fugaku working hand to hand, the Leaf will likely have a much more stable future. It's hard to tell how Minato would deal with the two advisors, Koharu and Hamura. It's likely that they'll still be running the political side of Konoha and will maintain their conservative hardliner stance. They may at times criticize Minato's policies if they view them as too soft and weigh in with their right-wing opinion, but at the end of the day, they'd have to let the Hokage do what he thinks is best. They're just advisors after all. They usually don't act out from behind the scenes like Danzo, so they won't be in Minato's crosshairs like Danzo will be. And with Hiruzen alive, he could keep them in check. I don't think Minato would dismantle the oligarchy that were the three students of Tobirama. However, Minato would have a stronger opinion and would not have been as much of a pushover as the third Hokage. Now, if we assume that Minato was just in the same position as Hiruzen, that he didn't know who was behind the Nine Tails incident, and somehow the Uchiha were still vilified and blamed for it and were on the verge of a coup nonetheless, then maybe he'd be forced to take more dramatic measures, but I still doubt that he'd go with the Danzo route. He'd likely only greenlight the massacre if it was absolutely necessary and there was no other way around it, but I still think that he could have negotiated something, unlike Hiruzen who just kept stalling. So yeah, if Minato maintains his role as the fourth Hokage and survives the Nine Tails attack, then things would have been a lot better for the Uchiha clan. And it's not even that Minato was a spectacularly good leader, it's more so that Hiruzen was a doormat of a Hokage, and the elders, Koharu, Hamura, and Danzo were vengeful hardliner geezers that weren't willing to make any concessions to the Uchiha clan, and the entire clan was demonized because of the attack of the Fox, which was completely blamed on them. So if Minato clears up their name and cooperates with Fugaku and makes some sort of compromise, then I don't see the clan being pushed enough to plot for the coup in the first place, especially considering that Fugaku didn't want the coup that much. Now Danzo will be Danzo, and he still might try some shit, but he won't have the same free pass that he had under the third's reign. Minato doesn't have the same emotional attachment that Hiruzen had with Danzo, and Minato's wise and rational enough to acknowledge the threat that the Foundation posed. Danzo would have to be very careful to not fall under the scrutiny of the fourth Hokage. It's hard to determine how the Uchiha clan's attitude in general will be towards the fourth, but if Fugaku vouches for him, then he should be in their good graces. Uchiha that are loyal to the village like Itachi and Shisui will likely be under the direct command of Minato, and as for any other Uchiha that remain bitter against the village's authority, well then Fugaku will just have to deal with them and brand them as traitors. And as long as it's not the majority point of view, then everything should be fine. I can see most of the Uchiha conceding to the village if they felt like they were being heard, with the only arguable exception being maybe Tekka, Inabi, and Yashiro. And with Obito either dead or in captivity and possibly having atoned for his sins, then there isn't much to threaten the relationship between the village and the clan. I can even see this now changed Obito forming an elite Uchiha and Konoha loyal squad alongside Itachi and Shisui. Now this will be a 3-man team that no one can defeat. I mean, I guess Itachi won't have the Mangekyo since Shisui will still be alive, but you know, we can maybe kill Izumi to give Itachi the MS. Then they'd be truly cracked, especially if you add Kakashi and Guy there. Oof. Now, this hypothetical would have a much bigger butterfly effect on the verse as a whole, as Naruto may not even become a Jinchuriki, and he definitely won't be an orphan. Sasuke would also not experience his family's genocide. Orochimaru could be stopped a lot earlier, which also means that no Yamato and Kabuto's story unfolding a bit differently. Pain would have a much harder time invading Konoha with Minato and the Uchiha there, and then Black Zetsu's plans could be foiled as well, but we're not here to discuss all of that today. All I wanted to know was how Minato would deal with the Uchiha crisis if he were still alive. And it's very possible that this specific catastrophe would have been averted. And it's not even that Minato's a perfect ruler, but it just goes to show that anyone even remotely competent would have done a much better job dealing with the Uchiha than the 4 geezers of the Elder Council. But yeah, this has been today's analysis. Now, if you haven't already checked out my Konoha propaganda video, then you should go watch that right now. And if you like videos about the Uchiha clan, then may I suggest that you check out my brand new playlist, the Uchiha playlist. You'll get to enjoy every Uchiha video on my channel. Other than that, I'll see you next time. Peace.